Perfect. Okay, so first thing we do is we go over the general characteristics of muscle tissue. And muscle tissue is actually easy when it comes to characteristics. It is cellular, just like epithelial tissue, which means we're going to have cells on top of cells next to cells. This is the one thing that is confusing about muscle tissue. The cells. The cells are called fibers, more specifically muscle fibers, which is confusing because they're not fibers, they're cells. But we don't call them cells, we call them muscle fibers. This is probably a historical term. When scientists were looking first at this tissue and they would see these elongated structures, they were fibers. They didn't realize they were looking at actual cells. So they began calling them muscle fibers. The name stuck and we're still using it. So don't be confused by the name. Every time you hear the term muscle fiber, you should think muscle cell. Okay? Now, we are trying to change these, but it's probably not going to happen in our lifetime. We're trying to change into myocytes, which is a better name. MY means muscle, and obviously cyte means cell. So that would be a better name for these cells. In the meantime, just be careful and realize that every time that you hear something called a muscle fiber, they're actually talking about a muscle cell, not a fiber. Okay. So that's the only thing that is confusing. Now, muscle tissue is vascular, so it does have blood vessels. In contrast with epithelial tissue, it can contract, shortened, and that is the function of the tissue right there. So all muscle tissue contracts, and it is adapted for movement of whatever the muscle is found. So it could be movement of bones, movement of the skin, movement of blood, movement of contents of an organ. We have three types of muscle tissue: skeletal tissue, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So let's start out with smooth muscle. I'm going to skip these. And also I'm going to point out there is a table in most books that will summarize the characteristics of each of these three different types of muscle tissue. And we'll come back to a table at the end so that we can summarize the information. So let's get started with the skeletal muscle tissue. Probably this is when we think of muscle, this is the muscle that we're depicting in our brains. This is the one that we think about when we think of the word muscle. Skeletal muscle fiber cells are huge cells. These are humongous cells that have a cylindrical shape. They're so huge that when you look at them under the microscope, you don't see the beginning or the end of the cell. All you see is just kind of like the little part of it right here. So you don't really see where the cell begins or ends because it continues on way past the field of view. That's one thing. The cells are huge. The other thing about these cells is that they're so big because during development, they were made by the fusion of many cells, which means that these cells are going to be multinucleated. They're going to have many nuclei. You can see here in one cell, several nuclei. So that's one of the characteristics. The cells are filled with contractile proteins, which are arranged in such a manner that they create these lines that you see there, called striations. So a skeletal muscle is a striated muscle. You can plainly see the striations. The location where it's found is attached to bone and skin. And so skeletal muscle is striated, multinucleated, huge cylindrical cells, and the skeletal muscle fibers is the names of the cells. Function is movement, also generation of heat right there. So when we talked about hypothermia, low body temperature, the organ that helps the body increase the temperature will be a skeletal muscle, which will begin to shake to try to create heat. The movement is going to be voluntary, and it's found attached to bones and in some instances skin. All right, let's move on to cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle, the shape of the cells is different from that of a skeletal muscle. The cells are described as branching. So, and by the way, the cells are smaller than those of skeletal muscle. So there's a little cell of cardiac muscle. They have one nuclei in the middle. And here's the next cell, which is also branching. The little nuclei of the next cell, right there. There's another cell. Okay, so the cell is described as branching. You can see the nuclei here. You can kind of see the branches there. Okay. It has one nucleus as opposed to many in the skeletal muscles. It does have striations. You can definitely see the striations. So it does have the little lines going along right there, going across, which tells you that the physiology of contraction will be similar to that of a skeletal muscle. Notice that cardiac muscle has these little lines in between the cells right there. So this little line here, this little line here, here, and here. These are called intercalated discs, and they are exclusive to cardiac muscle. No other muscle cell has those structures, which tells you it gives the cardiac muscle physiology a twist, a bit of a different way in which they work. All right, so those are the characteristics. The cells are going to be branched, uninucleated generally, and they do have striations and, more importantly, intercalated discs. The location of the tissue is, there we go, walls of heart. And when it comes to description of location of muscle, especially cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, you're always going to see the word walls. The tissue is described as being on the walls of the organ. Just like epithelial tissue is going to be on the surface lining the organ, the muscle tissue will be found on the walls of the organ. The function is involuntary movement of blood within the heart, and characteristics is striation, branched cells, intercalated discs, and typically one nucleus, which is in here somewhere. One nucleus, there you go. One nucleus, it says occasionally multinucleated. Okay, yeah, but we're just going to say one nucleus. The last of the muscle tissue, the smooth muscle, the name is smooth, tells you there are no striations. And you can see here how you don't see those lines going across on the cells. The cells are tiny. These are the smallest of muscle fibers. And they are spindle shaped with a little nuclei in the middle. So here you have a little muscle cell with a little nuclei and another little muscle cell with another nuclei. The cells are found on the walls, here's the word again, walls, of hollow organs, like the stomach, the intestines, the urinary bladder, the uterus, blood vessels. Can't think of anything else right now. Okay, so that's where they're found. It's found on the walls of hollow organs. This is probably one of the hardest tissues to identify, is that of a smooth muscle. And on the next session tomorrow, I'll have pictures of several different tissues, and we'll try to identify them as we go along. And so we'll come back to this tissue and show you, how it can be confused to other tissues. So as a summary, a smooth muscle, it's a spindle-shaped cells with one little nuclei and no striations. That's why it's called smooth. It's because it has no striations. Function, the involuntary movement of whatever is inside the organ, and it's the location in the walls of hollow organs or viscera, like a stomach, intestines, uterus, blood vessels, urinary bladder, etc. So those are the three types of muscle. And by the way, muscles are not going away. We're going to see them again in chapter 9. So we're going to review all these again in chapter 9. So oftentimes what I do is I make a little chart of the muscle tissues, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And then I go over the characteristics. So we have striations, yes, no. Location, where the muscle is found, bones, attached to bones, and skin. Okay, this doesn't write very well. Heart, and then hollow viscera. Okay. Nuclei, many, 1, 1. Intercalated discs, I'm going to put IDs, intercalated discs, no intercalated discs, yes intercalated discs, no intercalated discs. And then finally, whether the muscle is voluntary or involuntary. So this one is voluntary, involuntary, involuntary. I do want to talk a little bit about these voluntary versus involuntary. Voluntary muscle, which is a skeletal muscle, is a muscle that we can move at will. Involuntary muscle is obviously one that we cannot move at will. So no matter how hard we try, we cannot change voluntarily the beating of the heart or the movement of substances, the contraction of the stomach or the intestines. Now, a skeletal muscle is voluntary, we can move it at will. That doesn't mean that we're always moving it at will. Think, for example, of a skeletal muscle of respiration. The muscles that makes us breathe are all skeletal muscles. So the diaphragm, which is a breathing muscle, is a skeletal muscle. Intercostal muscles are breathing muscles. These are all skeletal muscles. We could move them at will and change the way we breathe. We typically don't do that though. Typically, we just relinquish autonomy of those muscles and breathe automatically, let other parts of our brain take care of contracting and relaxing those muscles so that we can not have to think about breathing all the time. So the fact that the muscle is voluntarily controlled doesn't mean that we are always controlling it voluntarily. It just means that we could if we wanted to. So I just wanted to make that small point. And I also wanted to point out that any textbook will have a little chart that does what we just did, which is to compare and contrast these different 3 types of muscles. Okay. The last of the tissues. If there are no questions, I'll move on to the last of the tissues right here. The last of the tissues that we have are the nervous tissue. And I do know we haven't covered connective. We'll do that tomorrow. But I do want to cover nervous tissue, which is a simple tissue, easy to go over. This is cellular tissue. Oops. And it consists of 2 types of cells. The main type of cells are the neurons, and then the glial cells, which are the supporting cells. Function of the tissue is to transmit electrical signals. So the neurons are going to create and transmit electrical signals. The glial cells are going to be the helper support cells that are going to keep the neurons alive by giving them oxygen and nutrients and removing the waste and performing other protective supporting functions. The location of this tissue is brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And yes, this neuron has different parts, and we're not worry about it now. We're going to have entire chapters dedicated to the neuron. So more important to me is just to have a little, overview of what the cells look like. These huge cells are going to be the neurons, and the little dots that you see all over are the glial cells. So that's your nervous tissue. So the chapter ends with taking another look at membranes, which we're going to do very quickly. We have already seen one type of membranes, which are the serous membranes that are found lining the interior of cavities and the surface of organs. The cutaneous membrane is essentially the skin made of epithelial tissue and connective tissue underneath. Mucous membranes are the membranes that are found lining body cavities open to the exterior, like the digestive tract and the respiratory tracts. The fact that the word lining is in there tells you that these membranes are made of epithelial tissue. These membranes are moist because they have goblet cells. We already know that. So the mucous membrane of the digestive tract is made mostly of simple columnar epithelium. With stratified stratified squamous epithelium in the esophagus and the oral cavity. The serous membranes of the respiratory tract, and actually this right here is the respiratory tract, not this little tube right here, is made of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So these mucous membranes are made of epithelial tissue. Serous membranes, we know they are double layer membranes made of mesothelium and connective tissue. They have two layers, a parietal and a visceral layer. And we know that the one that covers the heart is called the pericardium, the one covering the lungs is called the pleura, and the one found in the abdominal pelvic cavity is called the peritoneum. So it's a quick overview of membranes. And the last thing we want to do is go over inflammation, because it has to do with tissues. Inflammation, you should know the definition. By definition, inflammation is the response to tissue damage, to tissue injury. And so the goal of inflammation is to repair the tissue and restore function. You should definitely know the signs and symptoms of inflammation, which are redness, heat, swelling, pain, sometimes loss of function. You should know the reasons for the signs and symptoms. During inflammation, blood vessels dilate, and the dilation of blood vessels, meaning the blood vessels expand, bringing more blood to the area. That causes the redness and the heat. Blood vessels become porous, more permeable, and fluid escapes the blood vessel onto the tissue, causing the swelling of the tissue. The fluid presses on nerves, causing the pain. There may be clot happening also if blood vessels have been disturbed, have been broken. So during repair of the tissue, there is a clotting taking place, a lot of inflammatory chemicals. Remember the positive feedback mechanism. And as the tissue repairs, a whole host of little cells arrive at the area to repair the tissue, making the tissue look granular. And that's what this is called, granulation tissue. Collagen fibers are going to be formed that are going to bring together the broken pieces of the tissue and are going to lead, the excess of collagen being secreted will lead to a scar forming on the area that was repaired. So you should have an idea of inflammation, definitely know the definition of inflammation and the signs and symptoms of inflammation, redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Okay, so that takes care of that part of chapter 4. I will schedule a session for connective tissue, and I would also like to, when we go through that question through that session, connective tissue, I'll go ahead and review all tissues using slides, which will be helpful for lecture. We're not going to have pictures of tissues in lecture tests. We're going to have pictures only in the practical test. So in the lecture test, we're going to use descriptions of the tissue, matching questions between tissues and location, tissues and function, etc. Okay. All right. If there are no questions, I'm going to sign off, and I will again just schedule another session for tomorrow.